Hello, and welcome to our first video lecture for ENGL1001, Introduction to Composition and Rhetoric. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of threshold concepts in writing studies. This really pertains primarily to the content of Chapter 1 in the Writing About Writing textbook. So, what is writing studies? Well, it's a field of study that poses questions about how writing works. And when we're thinking about writing, we can talk about that in a very broad way. So we can talk about the various contexts in which writing occurs. We'll get into more detail about that as we move along. We can also talk about the different modes and modalities that writing encompasses. So for example, I wrote this PowerPoint presentation, but we could also talk about the way that I'm developing this as a video as a form of composing, right? Or how putting together a podcast is a form of composing because they involve the creation of text, and the process of editing and revising. And realistically, our definition of what even constitutes a text can be broader than just the written word on the page. Now, when we think about writing studies, we're really talking about a field of study that's relatively new, much newer than many of the other fields of study that you might be looking at in college. So this is a field of study that really took off, in the 1950s. And embodies a number of different subdisciplines, draws from literacy studies, rhetorical studies, and education. So one of the key concepts from this chapter that I want to take a little bit of time to talk about is this notion of having two stories about writing. And the authors of the textbook really want to discuss this in terms of the idea of a conception, right? And a conception is an idea that we have that shapes the way that we see the world, right? And those conceptions can be anything from what we think constitutes like good food to what we think is the right way for a country to govern itself, to conceptions that we have about ourselves, right? So like I have a conception about myself that I am not a particularly good singer, right? This is an idea about myself that has formed over time and shapes the way that I behave. And so the authors of the text want to argue that our conceptions about writing impact the way that we engage with writing as an activity, as a field of study, as something that we do. So, in the traditional story of writing, right, writing is simple, and good writing is always good writing, and grammar is something that we connect to being correct, right? So when we think about grammar, we think about having correct grammar. And then correctness is what we begin to associate with what constitutes quality, right? So if something is correct, then it's of higher quality. And the risk in this is that, at least one of the risks in this, is that we begin to associate correctness as being even more important than content, right? That the degree of polish in a piece is more important than what it actually has to say. And we begin to judge people and writers less on the content of their arguments and more on the surface features of how they make them. Another big risk with this traditional story, right, this idea that good writing is good writing, is that a corollary to that is a belief that good writers are good writers, right? You either are a good writer or you are not a good writer. And those kinds of beliefs, and they can be reinforced, as we'll talk about later with one of our threshold concepts, at various stages of our life, from our parents to our friends to our peers to our teachers. Those kinds of conceptions have a real impact on what we choose to invest our time in and our energy into. And so if you think that you are not a good writer, you may be less invested in becoming a better writer, right? Because you may say, well, that's just not who I am. And so in place of that, the authors want to offer what they call a counter story, right? A different way of conceiving what writing is. And in this new conception, writing is something that's robust and it's something that's very complex. It happens in a lot of different contexts for a lot of different purposes. And a key word here is the idea that good writing is contingent. Contingent simply means, sort of based on something else, right? So what counts as good writing really depends on a whole host of factors, from who your audience is to when you're doing the writing historically, to what you're trying to accomplish, to the ways in which you present your ideas, right? And so in this model, correctness can be relative and it can change, right? The English that is spoken in schools today and is not the same kind of English that was spoken, 50 or 100, 200 years ago, right? It shifts over time. And in this model, rather than thinking about correctness as the measure by which we determine quality, we instead turn our attention to effectiveness, right? So every piece of writing has a job to do, right? We write for a reason. And so we can determine whether or not a piece of writing was quote unquote good or not based on the degree to which it achieved what it was trying to achieve. And in this model then, content becomes as, and really arguably much more important than these sort of superficial notions of correctness. And so as you're thinking about what we're going to be talking about in this course, one of the things that I really want you to consider is what are the attitudes that you're bringing into the course about writing and about how writing works? And where do those attitudes come from, right? What have been your prior experiences with writing, and how have they shaped your sense of a self as a writer? And that's something that we're going to be teasing out as we make our way through the course. So again, why consider these stories, right? Why take the time to think about it? Well, as I said before, right, the stories that we tell ourselves matter, and they shape the way that we see ourselves, the way we see our abilities and our possibilities. And so if you go into a course like this saying, well, I'm not a good writer, that may be what you've been told, and it might mean that you have some struggles with your writing, but it doesn't mean that those struggles will always be there, and it doesn't mean that you can't improve. And the flip side of that is if you come into a class thinking that you are a good writer, the danger there is that you might think you don't have anything to learn, right? Or you don't have any ways to improve. And I definitely know that I was certainly guilty of that as an undergraduate, thinking that I knew exactly what I was doing and that I didn't need extra assistance, or that I would have this kind of in the bag, until I got that first C on a paper and I stopped back and said, oh, okay, wait, maybe I need to pay a little bit more attention. So thinking about how we conceive our ideas about writing and where those conceptions have come from can help us make better decisions about how we want to approach our writing tasks in the future. Now, a core principle here that I think is important to think about is that, as the text argues, right, writing isn't just something that people do. It's something that people study, and we can see this in a number of fields, right? Rhetoric and composition, writing studies, literacy studies, education. These are all scholarly disciplines that study in their various ways how writing works. So in the same way that a biologist studies the way that biology or principles of biology operate, in the same way that physicists try to understand the physical principles of our world, in the same way that historians try to better understand the way in which historical narrative is created, people in writing studies and associated fields are really trying to understand how writing works, right? What makes writing tick? Why are certain pieces of writing more effective than others? Why are some students more likely to succeed in certain tasks than others? Why do our views on writing change over time in the way that they do? How does new technology shape the way that composing practices shift over time? Just think about the ways that composing has changed over the past 20 years. When I was a student at Fairfield, you were not even guaranteed to have a computer, let alone a smartphone. We didn't have social media on campus until 2000 and probably 2003. That was a year or two into my time at Fairfield at that point. Twitter didn't exist. YouTube wasn't a thing. And so all these other modes of communication that we sort of take for granted didn't even exist. And so thinking through how changes in technology shape our writing practices is a key set of questions that we continue to ask, among others. And so to understand what writing studies is, or what rhetoric and composition is, as the authors sort of talk about, you need to begin to think about what they're going to call threshold concepts, right? And threshold concepts are really, simply put, these key ideas that help us understand the foundations of a discipline, right? And they are what set one discipline apart from another in many ways. So, many of you probably took English classes in high school, and those classes were really more grounded probably in the field of sort of literary study, right? So you might have read novels or plays or short stories. You might have thought about, literary analysis, terms associated with that. This is a different field of study, and as such, it kind of is operating from a different set of threshold concepts. And these are sort of core concepts that arrive as the result of ongoing research within a field that help us better understand the reality of that which we are studying. And oftentimes they sort of challenge commonplace knowledge or assumptions about a topic. And one of the things that's really interesting about threshold concepts is that they're not set in stone, right? So as research emerges, our understanding of our field changes, and good scholars are open to that kind of change. So what we're going to do now is quickly run through some of the core threshold concepts, and I'll just add a little bit of commentary from what gets discussed in the text, and maybe pose a couple of questions for you to be thinking about as we make our way through the rest of this week. So the four key threshold concepts that the authors present are that, one, writing is a process and all writers have more to learn. Writing is impacted by identities and prior experiences. Good writing is contextual, and people collaborate to get things done with writing. So when we say that writing is a process and all have more to learn, well, what does it mean that writing is a process and then we all have more to learn? Well, one of the things we have to notice is that writing is not perfectible, right? You cannot be a perfect writer, and the reason for this is that the meaning of your writing is largely determined by the person reading it, and the meaning that they derive or construct from your writing is going to depend on a number of factors that you can't control, right? From when they're reading it, to where they're reading it, to even the mood that they're in when they're reading it. To the assumptions that they make about you as a writer that you can do your best to try and manage, but can't really fully control at the end of the day. So there's no such thing as perfect writing, and that's actually a really good thing, because it means that we can remove the pressure of being perfect writers off of our backs, and we just get rid of it. From there, we can think about how practice helps you make better decisions, right? So effective writers think about the decisions that they're making while they're writing, and we'll talk more about this in terms of rhetoric later, but as a writer, you make decisions about what you have to say and how you're going to say it and the modes you're going to use to convey that information. And the more that you practice this particular skill across a variety of contexts, the easier it becomes for you to make decisions about how you want to express yourself, to what ends, to what purposes, to what audiences. And I suspect that you can see examples of this in your own life, right? So they give, I think social media is an example that they provide in the text. If you are someone who uses social media a lot, then I suspect that it is easier for you to construct a good social media message, right? Whether that's a tweet or a Facebook post or even a TikTok video, right? You come to understand through practice what makes for a good tweet, for example, right? Whereas as you become exposed to new genres or new writing contexts, and you have less experience with them, it becomes more difficult to think through the decisions that you need to make in order to be effective in composing in that particular kind of form. Why else can we think about writing as a process and that we all have more to learn? Well, as I sort of mentioned before, new situations and contexts for writing come up all the time, right? Every new technology creates a new context for writing. Every new industry, every new type of business creates new forms of writing. New kinds of artistic modes create new forms of writing. Our global context is constantly shifting. And so even quote unquote good writers need to stay on their toes and be able to adapt to changing conditions. Again, the same kinds of writing skills that someone would have needed to be, for example, a good, quote unquote, good college student 50 years ago are not the same skills that they would need now. The way that we do research has changed. The way that we construct arguments has changed. The way that we think about language has changed. And so we all have more to learn because writing is not something that is static, right? Our world is not something that is static. And because writing is always happening in response to our world in some way, shape, or form, that means that writing is always a dynamic practice that can always be further developed. And then finally, I think it's important to note this, right? No one person is good at all kinds of writing, right? We have our sort of niches that we're particularly good at or that we have a lot of practice in. But as an example, so I teach writing at the college level. My wife has her PhD in cognitive neuroscience. I would say that we're both good writers, but I do not believe that I could write an effective article in her field, in her discipline, because I don't have the same kind of fundamental understanding of what are the expectations within that field of study. And in the same way, it would take some adjusting on her part to get used to what good writing looks like in mine. And so I think it's very liberating to recognize that everyone coming into this class, myself included, has something to learn about the way that writing operates in a 21st century context. And so I think that that's something we kind of can take to heart, and that's maybe one of my favorite threshold concepts of my field, and one of the reasons why I think I enjoy it so much. Another key threshold concept is the idea that writing is impacted by past experiences. And this is something that I think we kind of know intuitively, but I think it's worth it to sort of flesh out, right? How you think about writing, how you even think about reading or composing your texts is shaped unavoidably by the experiences that you have had up until this point. And it can be influenced by a range of factors, right? Everything from the kind of school that you were able to attend, to the ways in which your parents engaged with writing or reading in the home, or supported writing, reading in the home. It could be impacted by interactions with individual teachers that you've had in the past, or the ways in which people have responded to your writing in the past, or successful or unsuccessful writing attempts that have, in both explicit and implicit ways, taught you something about the way that you think writing works, and therefore goes on to shape your behaviors as a writer moving forward. And so one of the things that we're really going to dig into, particularly in week 3 of this class, is really kind of consider the ways in which previous experiences or early experiences with literacy shape our ongoing development as readers and writers. And so as you think about this threshold concept, again, thinking back to how do you feel about yourself as a reader and writer? What kinds of texts do you find yourself drawn to, both as consumers and producers of texts? What are the parts of your life that have shaped those inclinations, right? Why maybe do you lean more to one kind of writing than another? Why do you feel less comfortable with one kind of writing than another? Why do you think about yourself as either a good or a bad or a struggling writer, based on things that may have happened to you previously? Because if we can think about that, and we can step back and think about how our prior experiences have shaped our understandings of ourselves as writers, that also allows us to make more reflective, more intentional choices about how we engage in this kind of material, these kinds of activities moving forward. A third threshold concept that we need to talk about, and that I think is really key to sort of internalize here, is that good writing is contextual, right? Good writing is contingent. What counts as good writing in one context may not count as good writing in another. Part of this is because writing accomplishes tasks. And so if your writing is, if you look at the writing and say, well, I think this was a very good essay, but it doesn't do what it needed to do, then was it really good? I don't know, right? What is the means by which we measure this? Writing is contextual in that our culture shifts, right? And so what counts as a good argument today might not count as a good argument tomorrow. Writing is subject to all sorts of limitations, right? From our audience, to the technologies that we use to compose, to the time and place in which we present our ideas, all of which impact the degree to which our writing is perceived as being effective. And I'll give just kind of this is sort of a silly example, but it was a good lesson, right? When I was an undergraduate at Fairfield, I was started as a physics major, and I was taking a class called Modern Physics Lab, and one of the major projects was to do a series of experiments and write a lab report and submit that for a grade. And I'm sure many of you have done lab reports in high school, and I'm guessing that if I asked you to identify some of the genre features of a lab report, you would say, well, it should have a hypothesis or method section, etc. Well, I was kind of a smartass and decided to submit my lab report as a haiku, right? A little 17-syllable poem. And while I think it was a very good haiku, it was probably a pretty awful lab report. And the professor, assigned me a grade, basically telling me that, right? And so, again, what counts as good writing can shift. And so we shouldn't get too hung up on the idea of good writing. We should really be thinking more in terms of what makes writing effective. Finally, our last major threshold concept that we'll just touch on today here is the idea that people collaborate to get things done with writing. So what does that mean? Well, writing does things, right? We write for purposes to accomplish certain things, even if what we're trying to accomplish is simply to get someone's attention, right? Why do we tweet? Because we want a response, right? We want people to see what we have composed and react in a particular kind of way. On the job, all kinds of writing happens that's designed to get things done. Even as a faculty member, right? I have to write emails, I have to write year-end reports. Writing performs a lot of functions in different kinds of community contexts. And what's important to kind of keep in mind with that is that it tells us two things, right? So that people find ways to make meaning together, right? We negotiate meaning together as readers and writers in a reciprocal relationship. But also that communities establish rules and conventions for writing, right? Again, we talked about, good writing is contextual. Well, part of that context is the communities within which we are doing that writing. And sometimes those rules are very explicit, right? They are very firm guidelines about what you need to do as a writer in this context, but other times those rules are implicit. And sort of the best example of that I can give at the moment is if you've ever been having like a family holiday, right? And you're getting around go around the dining table and you're about to sit down for food, there may be certain topics that you're not supposed to talk about at the table, right? Maybe it's religion, maybe it's politics, maybe it's that weird growth on Aunt Gerda's face, right? Whatever it happens to be. But you might know implicitly that in this particular community there are certain kinds of communication that are unwelcome. Or on a more serious note, right? If you're on a sports team, right, that there are certain ways that you communicate with your teammates that signal that you both belong to that group, but also enable you to communicate more effectively with that group of people. Now, the chapter closes with a concept called transfer. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about transfer right now, but we're going to come back to it in a couple of ways. When we're talking about transfer, we're really talking about the degree to which one is able to make use of prior learning, prior understanding, and apply it to new tasks. And there are a couple of different ways we can sort of tease this out, right? So we can talk about near versus far transfer. So how similar is the task, right? So maybe in high school you had to write like a literary analysis essay, and then you end up taking a class on American history in college. And while the requirements of the American literature in college, right? And maybe the requirements of the essay are a little bit different than what you've seen before, because you have some experience in writing in this sort of mode of literary analysis. In theory, you are going to have what we might consider a relatively near transfer to that particular kind of task. We can also talk about high road versus low road, right? So high road transfer versus low road transfer. How much intentional attention and reflection is required, right? So this often goes with near far, though not always. But in theory, something is high road transfer if you have to really sit back and think about how you're going to make use of what you've learned before in order to do this new task successfully. Whereas in a low road model, there's a certain automaticity to it, right? It just sort of comes naturally. And again, sometimes that is because the task itself might be relatively similar. And so why do we want to think about transfer? Well, for a couple of reasons. But a big one is thinking about how has your set of reading and writing and language and literacy experiences to this point prepares you for the work that you're going to engage in, not just in this course, but over the next 4 years at Fairfield University, right? And thinking about what are the kinds of skills, attitudes, practices that you've cultivated both in and out of school that you might be able to draw from as you are making use of them in to the purpose of succeeding in college. We also want to think about transfer in terms of how are you going to be able to take what you're learning in this class or any other class and carry that with you into other kinds of contexts, whether those are future courses or your civic life or your career after you graduate. So transfer is important in this course in a couple of different ways. One thing though that is kind of key to this concept of transfer, and something that we're going to be doing quite a bit of in this course, is reflection, right? Which helps you with meta-awareness and metacognition, right? The ability to think about your own thinking. And it increases the likelihood of successful transfer in the short and the long term. So the more you think about what you're doing as a writer and how you can make use of what you already know, the more successful you're going to be in doing so, because it will help you better identify your strengths and weaknesses as a writer. It will help you better identify the ways in which genres work together to produce meaning. As you're moving through the material this week, one of the things that I really would like you to be thinking about is how have your experiences to this point prepared you for the work that you're going to engage in. So I'm going to wrap up this lecture right now. If you haven't yet completed the activity for chapter 1, this would be a good time to go and dig into that. I'll get your responses as quickly as I can. And then once you've done that, you'll be ready to move into chapter 2.